Welcome to the Mental Fitness Podcast in partnership with Eliza Chat, where we explore real tools and stories for building mental strength in the modern world.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Jenna McGinnis from the University of Utah. Jenna oversees training and supervision for graduate students in the school psychology department, helping expand school-based mental and behavioral health services across the state.
Jenna's path into this work started by supporting women who were facing serious mental health challenges. This led her to focus on prevention at an earlier point in life through the school system, where support is more accessible. She brings a wealth of experience working directly with teens and is helping shape the next generation of school psychologists.
What's your role? And tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I work at the University of Utah in a lab in the school psychology department where we provide school mental health and behavioral health services to schools across the state. And so I oversee training and supervision of our graduate student clinicians who go out and do that work.
And talk a little bit about your academic background.
Yeah, how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so I did a year-long volunteer program where I was kind of like a case manager or case worker for women who had mental health and substance use issues. And I really enjoyed the work, but it was really difficult. So I decided to get my master's degree in clinical psychology. I went and did that. I spent a lot of time in a residential facility, which I found to be pretty difficult just because it was really severe. And I asked myself a lot, like, how could we support kids earlier on, which led me to looking into school psychology, where I wanted to be able to support mental health in schools where, you know, kids have to show up and remove some of those barriers to access. So then I went and got my PhD in school psychology.
And then you did a postdoc?
Yep. And then I did an internship as a part of that in Nebraska, and then I did my postdoc out here in Utah.
And then after that, stayed on staff.
Yep, that's right.
Awesome. So you saw very severe cases and thought, how do we help prevent this? Let's focus on teens. I love that. That's a lot. That's a lot like in our business outside of the podcast, why we also focus a lot on teens, is that's where the root of the problem is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Also, it's just like a really lovely age group. Like, so much is going on and it's cute and it's hard. But like when you see them get on the other side of all of the hard, it's just like, it's really beautiful. So yeah, it's rewarding.
That's awesome. So jumping right in, why are the teenage years so important for building emotional and mental strength?
Well, I think it's a important time. I mean, obviously, we would hope that there's a building of emotional and mental strength throughout like childhood. But if we think about teenagers, adolescents are getting close to getting out to being on their own, whether that's going into college, whether that's going into the workforce. And so being able to just handle tough things that come up is going to be really important for teens.
What about, because just like the human brain, the teenage years, neuroplasticity.
Sure.
Right? Like
yeah.
your brain's, this isn't a good way to say it, but like under construction in some ways, right?
Definitely.
So because of that, how important is it to focus on the right, principles or foundations of the wellness in those years?
Sure. Yeah. I think what you bring up a really great point, right? I think when I learned about it, it was almost like adolescence was almost like being a toddler again, with your brain having to go through all of these changes and working on pruning their pathways and just coming up with things that work the best for them. And so if we're thinking about why you want to learn those and kind of make them a habit, essentially, that means that it's just easier for them to do as they get older. And it becomes something that they go to quicker instead of having to struggle more before they get to a point where they ask for help or something like that. They might be able to use those skills earlier on.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. In your work, what's interesting too, like, neuroplasticity, like your brain can be molded in such different ways, but generationally too, from when or especially Dave, when Dave was a teenager.
Hey, now.
But there's different stressors today, right?
Sure.
Like you look at this digital world is crazily forced upon teens. So what are some of the top stressors today, like in your work, that you see teens are facing, and how are those different from past generations?
Yeah, I think if I'm reflecting on just like sessions that I've had previously, it's tough. I think, like you said, technology is a really big one. And so with technology is just like so much access to a lot of things that we probably didn't have when we were growing up, right? Like I had a Nokia phone, so I didn't have access to the internet. I like played Snake, and that's about it. And now if you think about phones today, most kids, one, get them younger than when I got them when I was a teen, and they can see everything. And so not only do they have all of this access to some of these things that are big and scary and stressful and just hard to understand, they can get it all day long. And so I think that's a really big one, a really big stressor. I also think teens today have been through a lot of really big events in the last few years, right? If we're thinking just like generally, COVID has been really difficult. Socially, emotionally, mentally, that was hard. And then just all of the other things that are going on in the world are difficult. And if you're able to see that and access that on a day-to-day basis, it can be really heavy.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So it's well documented. And I mean, there's a lot of people talking about the phones and social media and all the technology that's causing these problems. And you kind of touched on a little bit, bringing all these things to the forefront, but like just diving a little deeper on that. We know these things are stressors and causing mental health problems in teens, but let's get a little bit into more of the why. I mean, the way I've always thought about it is anxiety is the fear of the future, and it's the fear of things that you can't control. And when you bring all the world's problems through your phone to your attention, 99% of which you have no control over, then that just leads to an anxious state. But from your perspective, that's just my conclusion. I mean, how from a clinical standpoint, how do you see it? What the why?
I definitely think that's a part of it, right? You're just constantly getting all of this information and you don't necessarily have a way to do anything about it. And you might have really good ideas, right? But I think a lot of times if we're thinking about our teenagers, our adolescents, it's often like, oh, you don't need to worry about that. And then I think in this digital world, they're getting a lot of information, like you should be worried about this so much right now. And so that's even just like getting those conflicting messages can be difficult to navigate related to like expectations. I think that's probably like that's how I have experienced it with the kids that I work with. I also think aside from just access to all the content, if we're thinking social media in general, people are so much more connected these days. And so it's even harder to like put down boundaries, right? So if I get a text, I think we've been kind of conditioned to think like you need to answer that right away versus if I get an email, I can wait a little bit longer. And if we think back in time, people were like sending letters, right? And so I've been working with people still send letters. I know that. But like if we're thinking about some of the kids I worked with, they've said, I don't want to leave someone undelivered, which is like that message that you get when you send a text message, like underneath it pops up and it says delivered. Versus when I was a teen, it was probably like, oh, they left you on red. So you knew that they opened it.
Oh, yeah.
And then he didn't respond to you. And this is just like, it's automatic. Like as soon as it's delivered, like you get that message. And so that just kind of spoke to the pressure to respond so quickly and to be so socially available to friends or peers or things like that. And I think that is a lot of pressure.
That's interesting.
And just like being on, which obviously impacts other areas, right? Does it distract you from school or sleep or whatever it might be with like feeling like you need to be there and respond quickly?
When we think of overuse of the phone across the spectrum, you've probably seen a lot where on one end of the spectrum, you have kids that are spending 18 hours a day on their phone, and then maybe others that are spending relatively little. Based on your sample of the teens you're working with, what does it look like? What's the average teen that's coming in for counseling? What's the time they're spending on the phone?
Yeah, that is such a hard question. I think it just varies with having other hobbies too, right? So like you've said, I've seen the higher hours logged on phone, but I've also seen some that it's more manageable, right? But I think this is also kind of like why you're using the phone. So that can be kind of an issue too. So like people who are on the phone for a really long time, and it's things that are like they could be reading a book on their phone, and it could be a lot of time on their phone, right? But we could argue that it might be a different skill or a different use of time. Whereas I do have some kids who just watch a lot of TikToks. And then I have the flip side of that too, right? People are like, oh, my caregivers or my parents only allow me to be on my phones for a certain amount of time. But I think that shifts a lot at that teenage year because you just like have a little bit more freedom. And so, yeah, it's tricky. I don't know if I could put an average to it just because it's so variable. And then not only is it variable, but the perception of the problem with the phone or how it gets in the way of like well-being is not always salient.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
One question I was really curious about coming into this episode was identity formation for teens. Going back to like, generational differences, right?
Sure.
Like I'm imagining me trying to navigate a landscape as a teenager today and like forming my identity and like my authentic self. Like I feel like that could be challenging in the modern world, right? So like how does identity formation, the challenges there, play into emotional regulation in teens?
Yeah. I think what I've noticed is it's just very overwhelming, right? So I already mentioned this like constant messaging from different types of people. And then it's kind of like, well, who do I listen to and why do I choose to listen to this person? Whereas I didn't have access to all of these people or influencers or even just like famous people.
Yeah.
Like we have such easy access to these days. And so you kind of got what was put out there for you versus you get a lot more unfiltered content, which makes it even more difficult to be like, who do I want to be? How do I want to act? Is this something that aligns with my values and my goals? And that's all in the context of a time when they're trying to figure out what their values and their goals are for themselves. And so you just kind of combined two really difficult things. I know I also see a lot of teens who try to avoid areas of social media that end up being really difficult for their mental health, right? Just because it kind of like tags on or it sends you things as it relates to your algorithm. And so, yeah, I can imagine. I don't actually think I could imagine being a teen in this day and time and having to go through because I think it was like thinking about it right now as an adult, it's overwhelming. So I can't imagine having so many other demands and also trying to figure that out.
So going back to the common stressors, we've talked about phones generally, social media, having access to all these voices. What other modern day stressors, sort of unrelated to the technology, are there, if there are? And then what are some of the like stressors that have persisted through time?
Sure. I would say probably like through time or just your relationships with other people, whether that's your family, your siblings, your peers, all of that. It might look a little different. The things that you might talk about or have concerns about or have issues with your peers or your family might be a little different than they were when I was growing up or when, you all were growing up, but they're still there, right? Having to navigate those things, having to navigate the pressures of going to school, doing well, having to navigate other people's expectations of you and your future. All of those things are stressors that are still there.
Yes. I mean, there's stressors, right? And this is probably a good question for any listeners that are parents as well, right? So you've worked directly with teens. What are some signs that a teen is struggling, or maybe a parent, their teen is struggling, even when they're saying they're fine? Or, it's typical, like when I was a teenager, my parents always hated like, how was school? Good.
Yeah.
Like, that's
you're
it.
like one word answers.
Right? So again, like what are the signs a teen is struggling even when they say they're fine?
Yeah.
In your experience?
I think I would first say that I like to tell caregivers are kind of like the expert on their kids. So I can talk about what I've seen when I'm meeting with kids, but I also recognize that, all kids have different ways of emoting or expressing their frustrations. So being able to just notice that and trust your gut if things don't feel like the same as they were previously, to check in. But I think if I'm reflecting on what I see in session, one of the biggest ones is just kids calling themselves lazy. And with more digging, it's kind of like this lack of motivation, but also just kind of like this sense of overwhelm that is hard for them to just get through. And so they have then started labeling themselves as lazy, but really it's not lazy. It's maybe like a symptom of depression or just like a really, really difficult time that they're struggling through. And so I hear a lot of like, oh, I just need to do these small things, but I'm just so lazy, so I can't do it. Like, I just can't get out of my bed, things like that. And for me, it's like, oh, I should follow up with that a little bit more and kind of explore like, what is that laziness? And can we kind of adjust the way that we're thinking about that? So I think that's a really big one that I hear a lot, especially with adolescents. And I think another one would probably be just like social withdrawal. So less time with friends, less engagement. And obviously a little bit of that kind of makes sense in the teenage years. You probably lean more on your friends than your caregivers or your parents. But I would imagine parents are able to kind of tell.
Yeah. So kind of trust your gut. You know your kids, right? If you're seeing any like big changes out of nowhere, like isolation, or if they're really social and they're all of a sudden not social, like that might be a cue.
Yeah.
What are like the most commonly missed signs?
That's a good question. I think maybe both, for teachers and for caregivers, they're not necessarily missed, but they're like misattributed, right? So it's like maybe acting out is just seen as annoying or it's a behavioral problem, whereas like something else could be going on. Again, like that withdrawal might be like they're not engaged with school, but maybe internally something else is going on. So I think the adults out there are noticing some of these signs, but I think sometimes it's difficult to know or to dive deeper with the kid. And that's not always necessarily like a teacher's job, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it's not even necessarily a parent's job. The parent's job might be to like get the support for the kid. But I think just like noticing those changes, being aware of like difference in mood, difference in sleeping patterns, difference in eating patterns, difference in like social activity. If they have like a hobby that they really like a club or a sport, and they've decided to not do that anymore, that might be an indication that something's been more difficult lately. It's a lot, right? That's a lot of things to keep track of. And then you're also like monitoring your own mental health as an adult. So, and your own well-being.
Yeah. Because I think sometimes a parent can see cues or these signals, but just how generationally different, I feel like mental health, for instance, awareness is so much bigger now. I feel like teens really surprise me in a good way with just like, hey, I go to therapy. Yeah. I do this and that, right? Yeah. But like their parents, not to overgeneralize, but didn't grow up in that world, right? So if like a kid's struggling, and I've seen this in some ways, like it's like, hey, just, tighten your bootstraps and get over it. Just get through it.
I think what Jenna said, the misattributing. That's a big one. It's like something's changed in my teenager, but is that change just that they turned 14? And there's a biological change, and this is like expected behavior?
Right.
Or is that change due to some other underlying thing? Or like you said, there's just annoying behavior. Are they just trying to fit in? Or is there some other underlying pain that they're coping with in a negative way?
But what's the question I was kind of leading up to with that, like what Dave said, is what's one myth or like misconception about teen mental health today that worries you the most right now?
Oof. That is hard. I think the one that has, like if I'm thinking about sessions that I've had, it's that misconception of like my kid is lazy when there's a lot of other underlying things going on that might be more indicative of like anxiety or depression, or at least symptoms of those things. I also think just like mental health is a serious thing, and without adequate support, whatever level that means for someone, right? Like it can be a really big problem. And so, yeah, I think it's always better to check in and have those answers, or try to get those answers from your child, instead of just like assuming that they can definitely handle it all on their own, which I think comes back to being a teenager, right? Like they're in this phase where like they're wanting to do a lot of things on their own. They're trying to do a lot of things on their own. And we as adults are wanting them to like have those experiences too. But I think if I'm thinking about like, you know, when I was in training, I had somebody still checking in. Like I would try to do a therapy session, but I would have a supervisor. And so similarly, like with adults, like have them try to get through these things on their own, encourage them to try different strategies or maybe talk to somebody else, and also recognize that you might have to intervene.
What are those strategies or tools that you have seen most resonate with teens around, you know, emotional regulation or self-awareness or whatever that may be? Like what strategies do you see most successful, I guess, or resonate most?
I think in the moment, I talk with my teens a lot about like distraction strategies. So like how can you keep your calm in a space where other people might be looking at you, or just like how do you stay in the classroom? And so that could be something as simple as like counting backwards from 100 by sevens, or like spelling your full name backwards and like the names of other people backwards, right? Because it just like gets your brain off of that thing that you might be hyper focused on that's causing a lot of distress. So I see a lot of my clients do that. I also think,
and just diving in on that, that's the amygdala is the emotional part of your brain. You're having this emotional response, and what you're doing is changing the focus to something in the prefrontal cortex where you're counting or thinking or spelling.
Yeah.
And that creates some emotional regulation.
Yeah, you kind of like bring it back up into that like upstairs part of your brain, if you will, the part that can kind of do the logical thinking, do the abstract thinking, makes you who you are, right? Because like I'm sure you all have experienced times when you were stressed or overwhelmed or really angry or really sad, and then you reflect back on that time and you're like, oh, why did I do that?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I do that as an adult, and I have like a fully formed brain. And so then if you take a teenager who doesn't necessarily have a fully formed prefrontal cortex yet, so it might be more difficult to keep that in control, then you really want to bring it back online because things can kind of just devolve really quickly. So how do you just get them to slow down, right? How do we shift focus? And then maybe we can logically think about the stressor, what their friend said, an issue with the teacher, a bad grade, things like that before it's like a huge problem.
So you said that's like a tool in the moment. Are there other tools that are more like longer term? Maybe here's some homework for you to do between sessions, or?
Yeah, I think this probably depends on, not probably, this depends on like therapist and your client, right? So, but a lot of things that I do are just kind of, what are nice things that you can say to yourself? How can you, if you think something that's not very kind about yourself, how do you mitigate that? Or how do you kind of challenge that with two truths around whatever that lie is that you told yourself? Mm-hmm. I mean, I've talked with like different clients have enjoyed journaling or being able to write it down. I also think just like, this is not necessarily a tool, but psychoeducation in general can be so helpful. I think a lot of times, like we were talking about, we didn't necessarily grow up learning about all these things, learning about all those parts of the brain, but just being able to understand like why we reacted in a way that we're maybe not so proud of after the fact can be so helpful. It's like, yep, we've all been there. Like we can validate the emotion, we can validate the difficulties that they're experiencing, and we can acknowledge that maybe next time I don't want to scream at my parents, or I don't want to like throw my phone at the wall or something like that. So I think, yeah, it depends on how you think about tools, right? Some can be specific strategies, but others can be maybe broad things that they can reflect on their own time.
Yeah, I love that psychoeducation piece. I mean, that's something that resonates with me. I've always been kind of a why, asking why about things, right? Like, and leading to, you know, where we are now, like in my career and stuff, and focusing on mental health and stuff. It's just like, this is human biology. A lot of people in this exact situation feel this way. This is normal. And that I can imagine that's super powerful for teens. Like, okay, this is, you know, this fight or flight, or, you know, all these things, like that's just my nervous system and that's normal.
Yep.
Here's how to get through that, or here's how to help with that.
Right. And like, how do I notice when it's happening? Because I think a lot of times for a lot of people, it's just too late. Like you've gotten to a part point in time where you're like, oh shoot, like I'm too far gone, like my logical brain is not on. Obviously you're not having that thought in the moment, and then that's a problem. And then you kind of go back and you're like, oh, that is what made me so upset. And, you know, by talking with other people, whether it's a therapist, whether it's like a trusted adult, you can kind of start to figure out like, well, why did that make me so upset? Why did I respond that way? But yeah.
So pivoting a little bit to those adults that are around the teen, parents, coaches, mentors, what generally, from what you've seen, what can we all do better in supporting the mental health of our teens without pushing too hard or maybe well-intended, but being counterproductive to their mental health, where our goal is to support them, but the way we're attempting to provide support is actually harming?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it kind of goes back to what I said earlier, right? Like you know your kid, you have the relationship with your kid. And also another thing I said was all kids are different. And so you kind of unfortunately have to test out a few strategies to see what works best for your kids. But I would say overall, like being able to model like appropriate and healthy strategies is really good. Even if that's like, hey, I'm feeling a little stressed right now, just got home from work, I'm going to take 5 minutes. I don't know if that's deep breathing. I don't know if that's like a little yoga thing. I don't know if maybe it's a walk around the block, but like, how do you just kind of label and model what you're doing and show that you're using these strategies too? Because I think a lot of times if it's not modeled, it's hard to actually see. Or like I get a lot of kids where I'm like, well, just try it. And it's like, oh, I don't want to do that. That won't work for me. And it's like, okay, well, we just have to kind of explore and figure out what does work. But if that's not modeled, it might not feel like they can do that, or they might not know how to even try.
I love that. Yeah, leading by example almost, right? Because I mean, I'm certainly not a pro at parenting, but I've even seen that with like my 5-year-old. It's like trying to take those moments, like when he's frustrated, and definitely not a teenager, not ready to handle it, but then he'll, you know, I'll help him zoom out and be like, hey, sometimes I go through these hard things too. And guess what? I try to reframe it this way. And then it's really cool the next time that happens. Like, remember, Dad, just think this way or think differently. I'm like, hey, you totally get it. And you're only 5. So that's a powerful.
Yeah. And they're like, kids are always picking things up at such a young age, which is so cool and also can be really terrifying.
It's horrible when your kids start doing things that you don't like and you realize they got it from you.
Yes. Oh, so much.
It's horrible. It's the mirror. It's the self-reflected mirror, but you've created it over years. Yeah. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But I think it's that you're teaching them. But I think even if they're consciously trying to develop strategies and then they witness a parent or a loved one or a mentor effectively using a strategy, it's like, oh, like that's okay to excuse myself for 5 minutes. Like I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't know I could do that.
Yeah. Right. You allow that space and that time to kind of come back into that prefrontal cortex so you can then have a conversation. So it's like, sorry, I snapped at you, but it didn't get farther than that. It was just kind of like a brief moment of frustration instead of something that blows up. I also think just like, if it becomes a norm, it can be really helpful, right? And then everybody can respect that it looks different for everybody in the household. I think that's really helpful. I also would just say some things are really big issues, right? If we're thinking like thoughts of harming ourselves or other people, and those are not necessarily things that a parent should or can handle all on their own, right? And so having a few resources or trusted people that they know that they can go to is important. Yeah. It's not just you having to solve all of your child's like mental health and well-being issues, but like how can you support them in getting that help if it is a really, really big thing.
Yeah. So it's very individualized, obviously. What would you say is the most common mistake that parents make? And maybe it's along the lines of, like we talked about generationally, there's still a lack of recognition of mental health as a real thing, or I don't know if that's the more common thing, or or the helicopter parent that overreacts. I'm feeling a little stressed, and then the parent jumps in and tries to solve the problem instead of allowing the teen to develop those problem-solving skills on their own. What would you say from the kids that you work with? What do you pick up on as like the more common mistake?
I feel like that's a hard question. I don't know if I would call it a mistake, right? Just like area of growth.
Sorry. Okay. There you
That's
go.
way better.
For learning.
That's way better.
I love
phrase.
it.
But I think you do have a point. Mental health is just so big and it can seem so ambiguous, right? And just like hard to navigate. And I think a lot of times when we have topics like that, we are maybe more likely to avoid them or just like hope they kind of solve, right? And that might be our own anxiety or just like our own stress. And so I think just being able to have more open conversations would be helpful, whatever that looks like for a family.
Just
right?
communication.
Yeah. Checking in. What does that look like? Are we asking that, like, how was your day? Could be good, bad, fine, okay. But like, tell me about your day is already just a little bit different, right? It opens up the conversation a little more. I mean, your kid might say no, and then you got to figure it out from there. But how are you thinking about like how you could allow for that open conversation? Would be helpful.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. I have another question about kind of identity, right? So how does identity and, cultural background shape a teen's sense of mental resilience?
I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about individual differences in people, but we also know, like research says, that having a strong cultural identity can be a protective factor, right? And so it might be able to support your well-being, your mental resilience, right? Your culture might use different strategies that somebody from a different culture doesn't, and vice versa. And so those things might be really helpful. And the flip side of that is if you maybe don't feel connected to a culture, or you are repeatedly told that your culture is not accepted or your identity is not accepted, can have the reverse effect, right? Then it's like you're being attacked for who you are, which is really difficult. So it's a really big question that has a really big answer.
Yeah,
but I think
it's highly complex.
I like how your answer went more to the positive, supportive side first, that if you belong, if you have a strong cultural identity, it can be an asset to help you in difficult times and help you with your identity. And then obviously, I think we're all aware of when you belong to a culture that might be less accepted, whatever that is, or in whatever situation you are, that on that particular day, that cultural identity is less accepted. It can impact you. When you're working with teens that either positively or negatively have an experience related to their cultural identity, what are some of the tools that you give them, or how do you work through that? I mean, if a parent's listening to this and wants to develop that strong cultural identity, or is trying to combat a negative perception of a cultural identity, what are some of the tools that you do to help a teen and their developing brain go beyond themselves and recognize this macro cultural identity that's impacting how they feel?
I acknowledge obviously it depends on their identity or what's coming up, right? But I acknowledge that it's difficult for a lot of people. And hold space for that is like the big thing. Because I think sometimes, regardless of what your identity is, right, if you're belonging to one that's maybe not as accepted, it's difficult, and you're probably getting a lot of feedback about why it's not okay, or why you should be different, or whatever that is, or why you're not good enough, or XYZ. There's plenty of stuff out there that you can go and find as it relates to this identity or cultural identity. And so like I first hold the space and acknowledge that is a difficult thing to work through. I also acknowledge that, like, while I can support you here in session, I'm with you for like 45 to 50 minutes once a week, and for not that long of a time. And so how do you build up those other areas of resilience? So like, what do you want to lean on within your identity, or who in your circle do you want to lean on? Who can you talk to about this? How do you kind of navigate it, explore? What does that look like for you, right? Because it looks different for everybody, but I think the biggest thing is to have that support wherever it comes from, wherever it can come from.
Yeah.
With, this is the mental fitness podcast, right? So thinking less in like reactive care, which is kind of your role, right? And more of preventative or like proactive, right? What's a good mental, if just any teen, you could just hand them like a tiny playbook. What's a good mental fitness exercise that teens can build into their routine? Again, something preventative, not just like crisis-based or reactive.
Yeah. I think I would just go straight to those aspects of well-being, right? Like good sleep, healthy eating, drinking your water, like all those things that just like make you feel good in your body are going to be things that can help from a preventative standpoint.
So strengthen those core foundations first, right?
Right.
Like that's just general wellness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because that like impacts your mental state so much. Like if you don't get enough sleep, like I know I'm my worst self if I don't have a lot of sleep. I know like
Same.
I'll get through a day and I'll be like, why am I so groggy? And it's like, okay, well, you ate breakfast at 10 and it was a bowl of cereal and it's 4:00 and now you just want a bunch of snacks and like you can't make the last hour of work, right? So like how are you taking care of yourself just like on a physical basis almost, because that is going to impact your mental health.
Yeah.
If you could, from a trauma standpoint, we can't necessarily prepare for trauma, right? A loved one dies, an accident happens that impacts our physical health, something happens. But what types of things can someone do to build resilience so that when trauma strikes, we're less off balance?
Yeah. So I like to think of resilience as an individual factor, but also as like a community factor, right? So how are the areas where you find yourself also fostering your resilience? How can school foster your resilience? How can your family foster your resilience instead of us putting all of that on a kid to bounce back, right? Or even just like all that pressure on ourselves to bounce back. So how do you make sure you have a solid support system, whoever that looks like, right? How do you make sure you're engaging in these things on a day-to-day basis that help you be a healthy version of yourself, knowing that like you can't anticipate things that happen, or you can't always anticipate like how big they're going to hit you or overwhelm you or make you feel certain ways. But how do you kind of have those pieces already in place? People you can lean on, feeling safe to be able to talk to them. And I also acknowledge like not everybody has that, and that is hard to come by for a lot of people. So like how do you continue to seek that out? Is there one person at school, one adult that can be helpful, another friend who has somebody that they can talk to? So I acknowledge for kids it can be hard to find that and to feel like fully supported, and it can be really helpful just to like help support.
Yeah, with that, I guess from like the perspective of, school-aged setting or a teenager, how does emotional labeling or like literacy or, a growth mindset, how does that show up in school-age settings specifically?
To answer the emotional labeling, right? Just like acknowledging your feelings to a safe person is a really good example of just like, okay, that made me really mad. Sometimes it's really hard to do, to like tell someone or to acknowledge that was the feeling that you had, right? But so being able to acknowledge those feelings is an example. I also think in terms of just like growth mindset is just the willingness to try again and acknowledge that every time can't be perfect. I also, with a lot of my clients too, some of the things do feel overwhelming, or your mental health or your well-being has been maybe not in the best place for a while. And so things have built up, right? Whether that's homework, whether it's chores, and then we get to this place again where it's overwhelming. So how do we kind of put things into smaller chunks so that we can feel successful in achieving something? And someone else might be like, well, you just took the trash out, but it's like, well, it's been sitting there for 4 days though. And I did it. And so just like, how do you find small ways to be successful, to kind of support that growth mindset, to be able to come back to it, to acknowledge that I don't need to be perfect, but I need to try.
Yeah. Now I know when you're doing therapy, it's very individualized. You're also not giving advice. You're not giving advice, you're listening and responding to how they're doing and helping them cope through that. So this is wearing a little bit different hat. Mm-hmm. But what advice do you have for teens regarding healthy phone habits?
Feels weird to give advice when I probably don't have the healthiest phone habits myself.
None of us do.
Right?
I mean, or I guess maybe a meta question before that. There's got to be times when and I know that you're trained when you're in session, you're not giving advice. There's got to be times when you're just thinking, just stop doing this and your life will be so much better, right? Like, what are some of those things that you're screaming in your head sometimes with these kids? Like, just uninstall that app and your life will improve.
Yeah. It probably is a lot of times related to apps, or like set a limit, or put your phone on do not disturb at night. That is one that I do follow. Like, nobody is getting to me between the hours of like 10:15 and 7 a.m. But like yeah, it's hard too, right? Because like we've all talked to kids or teenagers and they tell you something and you're like, this is not the worst thing in the world. But for them in the moment, it can feel like a really terrible thing. And so obviously I'm not going to say it's not the worst thing in the world. But like, again, okay, what do you have? What can we build off of? Where can we make this feel a little bit better? How do we get through it? So yeah, sometimes it's like, oh gosh, I wish I could just make you do this. But we all have to learn in some way. So that would be my answer to that question, Dave.
One thing we love to do with guests is rapid fire questions. So some of them are like fun. Some of them are on this topic, right? So maybe we could just bounce back on a few of these. They're not hard. Early bird or night owl?
Early bird.
Okay.
Coffee, tea, or neither?
Tea.
What was your favorite high school subject?
Anatomy. Or
cool.
Spanish.
Oh, cool.
A mental fitness habit you swear by?
I read a lot. Like for fun. So that's or I go to yoga.
Speaking of reading, what's a book you've been gifted or you recommend the most?
That is too hard. That is way too hard.
First book that comes to mind.
Rapid fire.
First book that comes to mind that you would recommend us.
That's like one of the hardest questions for me. I read so much, but then it's just like, oh, what have I been reading? What's really good? It just depends on what you like, you know?
Okay, I'll do a new one.
Thank you. Let me think about it.
Okay. You're in charge of putting a giant billboard outside of a high school. What would it say?
You're welcome here.
You're welcome.
Take a deep breath. I don't know. Something that shows support.
One thing that instantly lifts your mood.
These are really hard. I don't know.
That's right.
Ice cream.
There you go. See that? That's perfect. What's something you believed when you were 16 or a teenager, but you no longer believe now?
Do people have really good answers for these?
You have really good answers.
You have really good answers.
I don't know. Now I'm like, well, was I too logical as a teenager, or was I too illogical that if I say it's like, that was so ridiculous, I can't believe you thought that, you know?
There you go.
Okay, most used app on your phone?
Probably Libby, which is a library app.
Oh, cool.
I know Libby.
Yeah.
I love that.
But you are a reader.
I've really spent a lot of my time.
I was going to ask the other questions, but I know your answer would be reading on all this.
Yeah.
After you said that about like lifting your mood.
Yep.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Jenna. This has been awesome discussion.
Yeah,
lots of good learnings and insights.
Yes, and we had a great discussion with Jenna. I think her extended experience working with teens is really helpful both for teens who might be listening as well as parents or loved ones who support teens. There's a lot of really good information in there. I think what stood out to you the most, Luke, from what Jenna shared?
I think the biggest thing is there's no simple answer to things. Like individuals, their backgrounds, their culture, their support system is highly complex and individualized. So there's no simple answer. Yeah. There's no blanket statements, and there shouldn't be, right? Yeah. Like support and resources should be highly personalized. So I think that's one thing that I've really learned here.
I think what stood out to me is how important it is as parents to model good behavior in terms of responding to stressful situations or mental health challenges, because that's going to teach our kids more than anything. And that probably stood out to me because I'm the one that has teenagers. So I've seen all of my mistakes reflected back towards me in my teen's life. So you two pay attention to what Jenna's wisdom there.
I've already seen it.
And make sure you implement it in your own lives. There's nothing more awesome and fulfilling than seeing your kids thrive in their life. And then every once in a while you see a little bit of you in it. And then there's nothing more painful than seeing them make mistakes that they learned from you.
Right. No, that's good.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you.